Hi guys, welcome to Sarah Says. This is the book review line of Sarah Says, for lack of a better description. But okay, so this is my first book review. In my introduction to my channel, I told you that I do have a master's degree in literature. I wanted to teach literature at a college level, but when I found out how much work it was for how little pay, I was like, I don't know about that. I mean, to really get paid for a literature position, you need to have a doctorate, and I don't want to go for a doctorate. So what I do instead is I work my regular job, which I make a lot of money at, and I'm very happy at, and instead I run a book club. So once a month we meet and we discuss a book, and we keep it really informal, even though I do have literary training and different things. We don't usually talk too much about the literary elements, but sometimes we do, because one of the other girls is also a lit major, so us lit geeks find that interesting to talk about. But for the most part, we keep it formal, and so I made some notes about the things that we talked about in last night's meeting, and this video is going to be the overview of the book, and then I'll do a second video that has spoilers in it. So what I would suggest is, if you want to be part of my YouTube book club, that you watch the overview. If you're interested in the book, read the book, and then watch my video with spoilers, where I talk more about the literary elements and delve a little deeper into the book itself. So this month's book was Orphan Train. I don't know if you can see that. I'll put that closer for you. By Christina Baker Kline. Several different covers for this book, but this is the one that I got. It's large print because it was free at the library. Most of the books that I do in my book club, I try to have them so that you can get them free at the library. So there's plenty of things you can do in life that don't require a lot of money, and this is one of them. So without further ado, a little bit about the book. So this is a story of two intersecting lives, two orphans. One is about an Irish girl growing up in the early 1900s. She was fresh off the boat from Ireland here to America, and through a series of events she becomes an orphan. And the other is Penobscot, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but Penobscot Indian girl who is in the present day foster care system, and her name is Molly, and the Irish girl's name is Vivian. So it's about their lives and how they come to intersect, and through a series of events we hear Vivian's story kind of through the eyes of Molly. The author, Christina Baker Kline, came across a nonfiction book published by the Fort Seward Historical Society, and in the book was an article titled, they called it Orphan Train. So Christina Baker Kline's husband, his grandfather was actually featured prominently in the article, and this is where she heard about orphan trains. So she started to do extensive research on orphan trains and found out that it's a little known part of our American history, and I found it really fascinating reading this book because it's something that I had no idea about. But there were over 200,000 children that were shipped off from the East Coast to the Midwest, Missouri, North Dakota, things like that. There were no background checks on the families that they were going to. They would literally post like wanted signs, and that would say Orphan Train coming on February 2nd, 1929. Basically first come, first serve, and these families would just show up, and it would be families that needed field hands or farm hands or girls to sew or a nanny for their kids, and they would pretty much just pick which one they wanted, sign a couple pieces of paper, and take this kid home. So some of the families were nice and wanted children to adopt and love, and other families basically wanted a slave or an indentured servant. They gave them a place to sleep, they fed them barely, and they had to work the farm or sew women's dresses, etc. I found it to be very eye-opening there's a lot of American history that we do not realize took place, or we don't pay much attention to it. And this is one of them. So let's see. The overall arching theme of the book is belonging, finding out who you are, finding your cultural identity, holding on to a piece of yourself as you move through life. She talks about portaging. Portaging is something that the Penobscot Indians did. They basically had to move from place to place, and they would take their canoes with them by foot over land to get to the next body of water. And so the only things that they could carry with them were the things that fit in their canoe. So they had to weed out what was important in their lives and take it with them in their canoes until they got to the next body of water to continue on with their path in life. So that's a theme that goes throughout the book, portaging. The book is extensively researched. I think Christina Baker Kline did a really good job of finding out the historical documents. The end of the book that I have has pictures and shows the wanted ads, pictures of the kids, the streets that she talks about. She puts in real historical places, and as an author, that's a really important thing, that you know what you're talking about when you write a book, so that you have some sort of credibility when people are reading this. Because, you know, if you grew up in New York and she names a street that doesn't exist in New York, it's gonna hold less truth for you. It's gonna take away from the book. So I thought she did that really well. Something else she did really well was time manage. When you write, it's extremely important to stay in your time period, and she was flipping from 2011 back to 1929, 1945. So Molly's life spans, her story spans over a few months, whereas Vivian's life spans over 20 some odd years. And she's able to flip back and forth between the two very well. So I really appreciated that from a writer standpoint. As she did some research about the orphan trains, she found out that their story wasn't really ever told. I guess maybe from a fictional standpoint, there were some people that recorded their stories, but she found out that many of the train riders never spoke about their past, either because they were ashamed of being orphans or because the pain was just too traumatic of what they had to go through. I mean, you have 5- and 6-year-old kids who, you know, their whole family has died, or some tragic event happens where they're just taken from everything that they know and shipped out to go be a slave, to be an indentured servant. And there's no pity for these children. There's no, I feel really bad that your parents are dead, or you have no connection to your home anymore. It was just like, oh well, suck it up. You're lucky to be alive, and you're lucky to be part of the system, and now you can go work as a field hand. So Christina Baker Kline found that many of these stories weren't told until their children and their grandchildren started to ask questions about their grandparents and their great-grandparents' lives. And pretty soon they found out that they weren't the only train. A lot of them thought they were the only train that was sent from the orphanage to the Midwest. This happened over 75 years of these trains going back and forth from the East Coast out to the West. And they found out that there was more than one train. And so they started to kind of form support groups and things like that and start to tell each other stories. So I thought that was really interesting too. Just looking here, I already covered a couple of these points. So Christina Baker Kline tried to avoid the reader preferring one storyline over the other. Like I said, she did interweave the timing pretty well, and she related the stories to each other. And she said she did this because she didn't want the reader to prefer one storyline over the other, but I unfortunately found that I cared a lot more about Vivian's story than I did about Molly's story. So despite her efforts, I still cared more about one character over the other, and I think that she could have fleshed out the character of Molly a little bit better than she did. I didn't like the ending of the story. I felt that it was unresolved for Molly. and I'm not going to go into why because that would spoil it for you. I'm going to do a second video with the spoilers, so I'll talk about it there. I did think that it was an interesting story from a historical standpoint. It was an easy read. However, I didn't find that the language was very poetic or lyrical or even overly descriptive. For me, I'm a big vocabulary person, so I like when those kind of musical words are woven in. Like, I really like Langston Hughes' poetry because his poems sound like what they mean. I like Anne Rice's books because she describes the characters so well that you feel like you really know them and that you can experience the story through their eyes. I thought it was well enough written, but I didn't feel that it was, from an artistic and lyrical standpoint, I didn't feel that it was as deep as it could be. But, on the other hand, it makes it a really easy read. So, a teenager could read this book, adolescent could read this book, relate to the historical context, which I think is the most important part, and still be able to read it without much difficulty. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the overall arching ideas in the book. I did like the book. I felt like I identified with the characters, or at least I empathized with the characters. I felt that it was well written as far as the timeline goes, but that it could have been fleshed out a little bit more as far as Molly, one of the main characters, and I think that she could have resolved it a little bit better towards the end. So that's the end of part 1, and part 2 is going to have the spoilers, so I'll see you for that one. Thanks for watching.